Welcome. Welcome to the second lecture of the Archive Online Academy program for 2024-2025. I think people are entering the room in this very moment, but I will start introducing very briefly today's lesson. Archive Online Academy is the educational project of the Archive Center devoted to the analysis and recording of cultural heritage in Venice. It's a partnership between Fondazione Giorgio Cini and Factum Foundation, supported by the Helen Hamlin Trust. My name is Costanza Blaskovic and I represent Factum Foundation. For students at partner university who needs the CFU, the credits, please follow the instructions in the chat or send a message here in Zoom on the chat to Fondazione Giorgio Cini profile with your name and surname at the entrance of the class and at the exit. Everybody in the audience is invited to ask questions or leave comments. You can do it here in the chat of Zoom or raising your hand. I will gather all messages and revert them to the speakers at the end of the lecture when we will have a dedicated question and answer time. We continue today with the topic access to image-based resources in the context of IIIF protocol. Last week, we saw 3 projects employing IIIF, Europeana, Illuminated Dante project, and the work in progress of Fondazione Giorgio Cini Digital Library. So we saw a landscape of various contexts, a European project gathering image-based resources for the GLAM institution around all Europe, hosting diverse collections and different types of cultural heritage. Then a project born within a university, Federico II in Napoli, devoted to the study of Dante's Divina Commedia, and especially the illustrated book editions, which are scattered around the globe. Finally, we saw the effort of displaying different collections of a private cultural institution, Fondazione Giorgio Cini, working to have the collections accessible and ready to be confronted with collections in other institutions, of course, on a digital library, which is IIIF compliant. And working also to add different tools to the digital library. So we saw many examples of books and books collections. Let's say all those we saw last week were 2D images. The IIIF standard, original designed for 2D images, is being now extended in the last year to support 3D contents, and this is the topic of today. This evolution allows for the sharing, viewing, and annotating of IIIF 3D models using the same principle that have made IIIF popular for 2D images. With this, we will dive in another dimension too, 2.5D. Well, the speakers later will dig into this. They will explain it, is that territory in between 2D and 3D, surfaces which have depth and volumetric dimensions, but subtle. 2.5D analysis and recording refers to the study of the surface of objects to the topography of the surface. Let me now introduce today's speakers, Thomas Flynn, John Barrett, and Dylan Schirmacher. Unfortunately, today's 4th speaker that was in the program, Richard Allen, is unable to attend due to an unforeseen event. So maybe we will finish a little bit early. Well, he said that probably will forward anyway the slides. So if you will be curious to that, we will probably join the slides in the archive website, well, where we will be publish also the video of this lesson. Let's now welcome Thomas Flynn, Digital Heritage Consultant and Editor of the Spatial Heritage Review. Previously, Thomas was Cultural Heritage Lead at Sketchpad and initiated the publication of the British Museum first open access 3D data. He will now introduce us to interoperable 3D with IIIF. He is co-chair of the IIIF 3D community group and has highlighted last week the IIIF community had and still has a crucial role in the development of open source software and technology, which benefits institutions and users. And that's why it's very important, this intervention. Thank you, and please welcome Thomas Flynn.
Thanks very much, Constanta. Just share my screen. You can see this okay?
Not yet.
Oh, no. Oh, I should press the share button, shouldn't I? That will help. There we go.
Yeah.
That better.
Great.
Cool. Well, thanks again for having me along. I will indeed be introducing you to the work of the IIIF 3D community and technical specification groups. If you're interested in the slides, I like to fill my presentations with lots of clickable links. So you could either go to bit.ly/IIIF3D_AOA, or you could use the QR code there if you want to grab a screenshot and open this later. There's a lot of, I guess, information that I can't include in this presentation, so there's a real reason to click through in your own time later on. Constanta's already given me a great introduction. Thank you very much. All I will say then is that being a co-chair of the IIIF 3D community group, I'm here, as a representative of many different people who are either part of the community group, part of the technical specification group, who are working on the things that I'll share during this presentation. But it's a really great group of heritage professionals and everyone kind of working towards improving the state of 3D digitization and publishing. And so you're very much welcome to join the group. The link there, please click through. And if you just want to listen in, that's great. But also if you would like to share your own work or your thoughts, or even challenge, some of the ideas that are being shared by others, I think it's a great friendly place to join if you're interested in these topics. So before looking specifically at the work of the IIIF 3D group, I just wanted to step back and give some background to 3D within cultural heritage. So the first thing I wanted to just kind of cover was the idea of who is producing 3D data. And currently, today, there is a huge amount of 3D data being captured, stored, processed, published by galleries, libraries, archives, museums, the GLAM community, so-called. Often, this will be in partnership with universities. Maybe the universities are conducting the digitization, or maybe they are, in fact, working on their own collections. And also, I should say that the 3D data, maybe when we talk of 3D data, it could be an object, it could be many objects in a collection, it could even be up to a building or a huge tract of land. There are different definitions of heritage, and there are different things that can be captured using 3D technology. So these organizations, the primary digitizing 3D cultural heritage, historical, artistic content at the moment. But then also there are non-profit companies or groups, I should say, and commercial companies that may be, again, commissioned to create data, or they may be working independently from, let's say, the core GLAM sector, digitizing things in 3D that relate to cultural heritage. And then so that data is obviously produced and held in a different context. And also there are many individuals around the world who have discovered how easy it can be to create 3D data using, for example, a smartphone and free apps or open source software to perhaps digitize the heritage around them. It's something that almost comes naturally similarly to photography as a hobby, people are creating captures of objects, subjects around them locally that fall into the category of cultural heritage. So there's a whole range of data being produced, and that's kind of the backdrop to the idea of, well, how do we work interoperably between these groups, between these different use cases? And when I say 3D, I think it's worth defining a little bit what we mean by 3D, because if I say 3D, perhaps in your mind you think of video games, or you think of visual effects in films, you think of virtual reality, maybe you think of any number of things, because 3D doesn't just mean one thing. What I'm mostly talking about are digital 3D models, so discrete 3D files that represent perhaps an object or some other kind of subject. As I say, anything from a tiny coin all the way up to a mountain. These can all be captured in 3D, or even, as we'll see in a minute, illustrated with 3D. But one of the values of 3D models, if you have a huge library that I just described being created by heritage professionals and enthusiasts around the world, once you have a library of 3D content, you can begin to use it in different contexts. So perhaps you are displaying 3D models individually on an online collection, say for a museum, but perhaps you are reusing that content to create image renders, create an augmented reality experience, or some virtual reality, maybe even a filter for a social media platform. There are many things that you can do with 3D, but it kind of is underpinned by kind of having a library of content that you can then bring together. And through bringing it together, you're able to either contrast or compare the 3D and begin to tell some kind of narrative, perhaps. So going back again to the kind of 3D models, one could be produced through 3D capture, so 3D scanning, and that could be photogrammetry, laser scanning, structured light, CT scanning. These all can output a 3D mesh model or a point cloud, different kinds of 3D files, many different formats. They might be the creation of 3D data. So if you imagine an illustration in 3D, or perhaps a reconstruction in 3D. And then also it's possible to visualize other data in 3D. And this might be especially useful, for example, mapping some kind of data to a map or a 3D space to better explain some aspect of that data set. One of the, I suppose, primary reasons, or one of the main reasons that heritage organizations exist are to educate and to tell stories. So this is kind of, again, an underpinning concept is why are we capturing things in 3D? Why are we publishing things in 3D? They obviously have context and they have meaning, so that we can tell stories. So it's almost the reason, you don't just digitize heritage collections for the fun of it necessarily. You may do, maybe you're experimenting, but generally there'll be a narrative context to any object in a given collection. So that could mean stories as a narrative. So, kind of illustrating this happened, that happened at this time in history. It's also about communication and education. So it's not just about explaining kind of what happened, but then interpreting that within a context, whether that's for your organization or for the general use, say within different educational frameworks. A kind of an aspect of storytelling for 3D that goes beyond just the 3D file are the different ways that you can provide context for that 3D or that subject in 3D. So what environment have you placed it in? What lighting, what animation have you added, or can be used to explain a subject, or give context to some scan data or any other data for that matter in 3D. There's also a concept of holistic digitization. So if one is capturing a historical subject in 3D, let's say a statue, it's important, obviously, not just to capture the shape, for example, of that statue. You're also capturing the state of that subject at that particular time, in a particular context with particular technology. And around that subject, again, are these the historical context of that subject. So while we capture something in 3D, it's also a good idea to consider a more holistic digitization approach, so that in that capture activity, we're also capturing, or at least connecting, the 3D data with the context of that historical subject, so that we create something akin to a memory twin, as opposed to just a simple digital copy of a real life subject, for example. With 3D, it's possible to author stories that allow for interactivity and some agency from the end user. So I mentioned earlier the idea of video games, and if anyone's familiar with a video game, there's an input from the user and it will have some effect on the virtual world. There are many games that are narrative driven, so that there is a story and you progress through it to either experience it or to affect what happens. And so this is a nice kind of concept to bring to that library of 3D data that is available. What can people, how can they interact with it, whether they are, let's say, members of the general public, or perhaps if they are a heritage professional. There are different audiences that require different experiences. And then finally, with storytelling, I think it's important to kind of call out, well, whose stories are being told and what stories are being reinforced by this new technology. And is it possible to make it easier for other perspectives to be brought forward through the use of such technologies as 3D digitization? And this is a question for everyone on the call to consider. And then there's this idea that 3D can be sometimes thought of as kind of, well, it's innovative in and of itself. We have a 3D model, great, it's better than the photograph that we had before of a given subject. But I think it's more about not replacing other media when we're storytelling with heritage content, but just one of many different ingredients that a storyteller can combine to create engaging, meaningful, articulate, and vital stories to tell to audiences. And I'll come back to this idea later, this idea of combining different elements along with 3D or around 3D data. Some challenges and opportunities for the heritage sector then. I think that the heritage sector is generally good at, so by the heritage sector, I mean the galleries, libraries, archives, museums, universities, non-profits, commercial companies, everyone producing the data generally are quite good at digitizing to a high quality. And that quality varies from organization to organization, from professional to professional, and place to place, country to country. The heritage sector is generally good at presenting these individual subjects online, in, for example, an online collection. Generally good at addressing long-term data storage. Maybe not so much for 3D. There's a question of technical support within a lot of organizations when it comes to handling 3D files and 3D project files and associated data that doesn't necessarily fit into many digital asset management systems or content management systems that many heritage organizations use. But there is the knowledge and the intention of taking care of data into perpetuity. And then this idea of information authority, and I bring this up within the context of an age we live in where information authority is a valuable asset for any organization, compared to the, for example, AI generated or deep fake content that is being created at the same time. So establishing kind of an authority for information, which has a tension with that other point I was making about inviting other people to tell their stories with heritage data. The heritage sector is generally less good at authoring scenes and experiences. There are many great examples, I should say, of heritage experiences, whether they're online or offline or at galleries in physical spaces. But generally, across, if you kind of averaged it out, I think there aren't many tools or processes that are commonly used and used across organizations of different sizes to create scenes and experiences with 3D content. We're kind of still stuck in a kind of, here's a library of 3D that you can browse individually. Also, there's kind of an opportunity or a challenge to export the data, the 3D and related data, so what this thing is, how it was made, beyond the sector, and to offer it up for reuse, say, for example, in the news sector or creative industries. And when I say exporting 3D, I mean the technical files. That's one kind of opportunity, is to address how do you package up all this data kind of technically, but then also how might better or rather more engaged relationships between sectors benefit each other to tell stories again and to educate. One final note in this section then, it's about sort of thinking beyond commercial spaces for heritage data. So commercial platforms like Sketchfab have become a de facto publishing channel for many cultural heritage organizations, especially for those organizations that are less well funded, have fewer staff. It's just easier to use a free commercial service. And these services, not just Sketchfab, there are others, have particular uses that can be very valuable, I think, for the heritage sector. It's also beyond time that the heritage sector is able to support repeatable and rich open access 3D experiences. So going from either just simply displaying a 3D model to something more interactive and narrative driven. There's a lot of clever people out there working on different things, and that's kind of where the IIIF group kind of meets in some ways, is at the edge of what these heritage professionals are doing to create this or fulfill this opportunity. But then I think it's worth also thinking, well, why can't we do both? Why can't especially if it's an open access 3D file, or even if it's not, how can a digital file be best served in its purpose by existing in multiple contexts, whether that's on a commercial platform, on an open access academic site, or even made available for download for other people? Is there a value there in spreading the data onto as many platforms as possible? I would say yes, but I'll leave it up to you to think about that. I'll pause just there. I don't know, Constanta, if there are any questions. Otherwise, I will dive into talking about the 3D groups.
Not for the moment.
Lovely. Okay. So the IIIF 3D groups. So there are really two groups, the community group and the technical specification group. So the TSG group is often the abbreviation there. The community group was established in 2018 to bring together people working on 3D projects to learn from one another, establish user stories, and we'll look at them in a bit, and meet once a month online to discuss and kind of lay the foundations for plans for interoperable 3D within the cultural heritage sector. So I'll just briefly introduce you to some of that work as well. It's, as I say, a group that meets about once a month, every 4 weeks on a Thursday. And it's a much needed forum for heritage professionals working with 3D. I was at an event at the Rijksmuseum running a workshop for heritage professionals looking into what they need with regards to 3D in general. And one of the things that came up was a community of people to poll and work with and learn from within the heritage sector. So in one sense, the community group just exists as a forum for people to connect with like-minded people. There are other ones, for example, Image Muse is also another great community as well. But that's kind of a core reason for it existing is to get people interested in 3D, give them a chance to learn about 3D and what you can do with it. As I say, yep, you can learn about other people's work and share your own. And we try to maintain a fairly regular engagement with guest speakers from within and without the core heritage space, talking about how they're using 3D. So that might be, for example, a commercial company. We had History, a company that makes augmented reality exhibitions, present to the group the other day, but it might also be somebody from a particular museum or library sharing a particular project that they're working on as well. So a regular event where people can talk about their work and learn from others. And there's no such thing as a dumb question. I think this is, it's a very, I said it before, a very friendly group. And I think you could do worse than to sign up just if you're new to 3D to learn from people that are doing some very clever work with it and ask your own questions. The technical specification group then is a slightly newer group established in 2021, working on drafting updates and additions to the existing IIIF specification. So I believe you're aware of the IIIF specification and framework that exists, updating and adding to that to accommodate 3D. And they meet every 2 weeks online. It's a kind of a smaller group of developers and IIIF editors really working at making what has been discussed for a long time within the community group into something that's workable and usable as a piece of technology. As I said, if you're familiar with how IIIF for 2D works, that the idea that there's somewhere a server full of images that can be queried and provide a digital object, and then there's maybe it's the same server but a different place. The metadata related to those images can be combined via the presentation API and delivered to a web browser, and these are distributed servers existing on many different web servers across the globe in different organizations. So there's that real value of being able to access multiple collections, bring them together in rich and interesting ways, deep zooms, for example, for 2D, focusing on different parts of an image, different views on an image to then present them to an audience. And this is very well used, very well developed. Looking then at the aspiration for 3D, this is, I should say as well that I'm not a developer myself, so this is kind of like a mock-up that I've just used to kind of visualize for myself what we're talking about in the future is to go from a IIIF manifest that includes all the references to 3D models and other content hosted on different web servers, combining it into a 3D scene in a web browser. So I've just tried to illustrate this is just using Blender to mock this up. Different views on a 3D model, media content, video, and imagery, audio, text, all kind of pulled together in a 3D space. Different things annotated into the scene. And that's kind of the promise for me of IIIF, and this, the ability to author something like this in a fairly straightforward manner, I think. So one of the first things that the technical specification group had to address was how does one deal with 3D content within the existing concept of a canvas. So if you're familiar with IIIF 2D, things are annotated into a canvas. So you're bringing in different images, for example, and other content to be displayed in a canvas in various ways. This, after a lot of thinking, the TSG, it became clear to the technical specification group that there needed to be a slightly different concept for the container for 3D content compared to 2D content. So there's the concept of a scene compared to a canvas, because obviously we have a third dimension. We can place things and annotate them, move them up and down, left and right, back and forth. We can rotate them in 3D space. We can also scale them as well. We can do different things compared to a 2D canvas. So defining that scene was one of the first activities of the group, and what kind of they came up with is that a scene in IIIF is a virtual container that represents a boundless three-dimensional space and has content, resources, lights, and cameras positioned at locations within it. And that's kind of the quickest summary, I think. So there's no, I showed a box just there in the previous slide, but it's in fact an infinite space that you could keep adding content to in theory until your web browser or your computer kind of ran out of power. And the same concepts running through the IIIF or the in development IIIF spec for 3D follow the Web3C web annotation data model to dynamically add this content and objects into a scene. So there's new things, but they are done in the same standard ways or as close as possible to follow existing paradigms for the work of the IIIF 2D framework. There are, however, some complexities of 3D, and not just the concept of 3D, but also how organizations produce and create 3D content. So some things are related to just simple facts of what a 3D file is, and others are about workflows. There's a concept then of, I mentioned, kind of single models versus a scene. So you may have a single 3D file that contains one 3D model, or you may have a scene which contains multiple individual 3D models that add up to a contained 3D scene in a file format. This is kind of fairly confusing stuff, but this is what's being worked through. You may also have multiple files that represent the same thing. So, for example, tiled data sets. For example, something like Google Maps, you may be familiar with how, as you zoom in and out, different tiles will load. There's a similar concept with 3D file formats. So there's different ways, even before you begin putting a 3D file into a IIIF scene, that you need to understand what you're receiving in what file format. For example, what scale. If I create a 3D scan of, say, a chess piece like we have here, I may not have scaled it correctly, and when it gets loaded into a scene, it may be the size, in theory, of a house or of a mouse. It could be, it needs to be an agreed unit of scale for 3D. As I mentioned, different file formats for 3D exist, and these different file formats support different things, and they don't necessarily even, they're not even necessarily able to be opened in a web browser. So there's kind of preparing 3D data to be made interoperable and published online as a concept in a workflow. The 3D model, when you load it, it may be facing to the reverse of the scene, to the ceiling, to the floor, let's say. This needs to be taken into account. There's the idea of resolution. If we begin annotating many very high resolution 3D models into a scene, we'll rapidly run out of computer power to render that scene effectively. So again, 3D data needs to be prepared in different resolutions before it's kind of made interoperable or made available. Then we consider, well, how are we looking at this 3D model in 3D space? So there's a concept of a camera that points in some direction within the scene, and this must be defined. It needs to be defined how close, how far away, what position within 3D space. Is there a concept of zoom or of field of view for this camera? And these all will affect how a piece of 3D is rendered. The 3D data might be animated. how is that handled in terms of user interaction, the concept of time, as well as the 3 dimensions that we're working with, and is that animation embedded within the 3D model itself? Is that animation something that has been coded through the framework, for example, to move something on a user interaction? You click this and then the chess piece jumps forward to the next spot, for example. And then again, that idea of lighting, generally speaking, if you have a 3D model in 3D space and there's no lights, you will not be able to see it, even if you have a camera. So then you have to think about how are we lighting our 3D models. So there's all these concepts analogous to things in real life that need to be considered as we make things interoperable. If my 3D file that I upload looks one way under some lighting with some kind of camera at some resolution, is that comparable with somebody else's 3D model that we've added to the same scene? To wrap everyone's heads around kind of the almost infinite possibilities, that boundless 3D space, the TSG first began developing user stories. So if you're not familiar with user stories, they can help direct a project, in this case, kind of the development of a framework and a standard within a more narrow scope. So polling the community group, the co-chairs and the TSG group were able to begin defining, well, what do people generally want to do with 3D? I think these are the things that should be addressed first as the framework for 3D is developed. So there's the user stories you can click through and read through them on GitHub, and very simply, they can be very low level. You want to display a 3D model, specifying the position, orientation, and scale. That might be kind of level 1. Then maybe you want to display multiple 3D models in a shared space, and that comes with its own considerations. You may then also want to display 3D alongside 2D and other audiovisual content within a single viewing experience. And then you might annotate, display 3D models with commentary. So for example, text, you may be familiar with kind of hotspots that you might click and then get more information about a subject. So these user stories are kind of almost milestones that the TSG is working through as it moves towards developing a first version of the IIIF spec for 3D. There are a number of feasibility demos by different developers using different 3D viewers, online 3D viewers. So we have kind of a demo. This is a fairly old slide, so there are other demos that exist now, but the IIIF viewer, Google Model Viewer, there was a demo on Sketchfab, Smithsonian Voyager, and X3D, all different 3D viewers that will most likely work in your web browser right now. And the task was simply to repeat the same thing in the same way in these different viewers, and then consider, well, okay, how do we create the plumbing and the framework that will then allow this to be repeated again and again. A more recent demo, and this may look kind of very straightforward and simple, but I think getting the foundations right is the most important thing, I think, that the groups can do, so that down the line things don't go out of control. And so what you can see with our little spaceman that we had in the previous demo is we've annotated the 3D model of the spaceman into the 3D space, but also a 2D IIIF canvas has been annotated as a texture file on a plane into the same space. So there are 2 references you might be able to see in the bottom right. Kind of, you can see the reference to the National Gallery of Art's IIIF server for that particular image. And so this kind of gives you an idea of kind of not, don't want to say baby steps, but the steps that need to be kind of gone through. Okay, we've got a 3D model in space. What other things can we do? And work through those user stories. I'm almost done, and I hope that's given a good idea of the work of the 2 IIIF 3D groups. And I'll just mention a couple of, well, maybe one more element to the discussion about extending interoperability. So obviously the IIIF group is primarily focused on interoperability within the heritage sector. And I mentioned before that there's this opportunity to provide wider access to GLAM or heritage 3D data and the associated context and records, everything about a particular subject, to make it available to other parties for reuse, such as education, news, film and TV, interactive games, and commercial. The heritage sector is not the only sector working with 3D data. There is a related but different initiative that exists right now called OpenUSD. And OpenUSD, if you're not familiar, USD stands for Universal Scene Description. And it's a file format that does a lot more than a traditional 3D file. I can't remember exactly when it was founded, or rather developed and released, but the founding members, you'll note, are not heritage organizations. Pixar, Adobe, Apple, Autodesk, NVIDIA, and then general members working on the development of this file format, which is an open format for 3D data interchange. So it's primarily designed for, if I create a 3D file, I want to send it to you, and you want to open it in a different software, and you want it all to open and look as it should, which you can see kind of how this matches up a bit, hopefully, with the work of the IIIF group. It's supported by a cross-industry consortium, as I mentioned, and the IIIF 3D community group has made some initial introductions to this other industry group, looking at, well, what overlap is there between the work that we're doing and that they're doing, and what possibilities are there for learning from each other, and looking at interoperability beyond the use cases within our groups. It's very early days, but I think it's a really nice kind of start to a relationship between these groups. If you're interested, you can go and check out openusd.org, and there's an article, The Importance of 3D Standards Development for the Museum Sector, by Scott Geffert from the Met Museum, which goes into some more details as well, if you're kind of interested in kind of exploring kind of the possibilities of the USD file format. Thank you for listening. I'm going to stop there. These links can be explored as you like, and I hope this has been useful as an introduction.
Thank you. Very useful, very interested. And well, I think that the conversation now continues concentrated on a single project, so on a specific experience, but that is matching very, very, very well. John Barrett is senior photographer at for Bodleian Libraries, Oxford. His work involves the development of new methods of recording special collection material. John is technical lead at the Bodleian for Archeox, which stands for Analysis and Recording of Cultural Heritage in Oxford. And Dylan Schirmacher works within Archeox in the Bodleian Library Imaging Lab. They will talk today about the recording of the Oxford University's collection in 3D, exploring the techniques used to make 2.5D and 3D recordings, and demonstrating the need to find ways to surface them. And of course, this is the link. Thank you.
Thanks, Costanza. Can you see my screen? Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Perfect. Thanks, Thomas. That was a really interesting presentation, and good afternoon, everyone. And it's really nice to be back at the AOA after last year. And Costanza has asked me to share some of the recordings that I've made over the last year and to update you about what is going on with analysis and recording of cultural heritage in Oxford. I'm going to be joined by Dylan, who's going to be here quite shortly. And we're going to demonstrate the need for finding ways of being able to surface the recordings which we're making. And that's really the theme of what I'm going to be talking about. So we're slightly off topic, focusing on the 3D recording rather than the delivery. But I think Thomas has done a great job in sort of discussing ways in which we can think about how we can deliver recordings which are IIIF compliant in the future, which is essential for what we're doing. Because actually it's very easy to make the recordings, but a question that I get asked all the time is how can we surface these recordings? How can we publish these recordings? Which is a far, far more difficult question to answer. And we found that throughout imaging, I think throughout photography, we've always had an easy way of making recordings and making photographs, and it's far, far more difficult to deliver those. So that's what I'm going to be talking about during my presentation. Last June, I was asked to provide a contribution for the Academy, and we did 2 sessions for Archeox, which covered the recordings of the technology in quite a bit of depth. So if you are interested in learning at a greater depth about how we make our recordings, I would recommend going to the AOA website and taking a look at those sessions, which we called Exploring the Potential of Photometric Stereo 3D Capture. So have a look on the archive site if you'd like to learn about those techniques. So Archeox, the analysis and recording of cultural heritage in Oxford, began in January 2022. And just as with IIIF, the project has been funded by the Helen Hamlin Trust, and we are just approaching the second phase of funding from the Helen Hamlin Trust. And obviously, we keep our fingers crossed that we will be able to secure more funding to take Archeox further. And in essence, the aim of the project has been to record originals across Oxford University's institutions, the GLAM institutions that Thomas was talking about, gardens, libraries, and museums across Oxford University. So that although the recording technology has been pioneered at the Bodleian Library, it is for the benefit of all of these Oxford University institutions. And we're using a new recording system, which is called the Selene, and that was created by the Factum Foundation, who are our project partners, and specifically Jorge Cano, who has developed the machine and continues to develop the software behind it, which is really, really important to the photometric stereo process, which I'm going to sort of recap on. And also in the second phase, as well as taking the technology to record in other institutions around Oxford University, we've also introduced photogrammetry into the recordings that we're making. So it's not just photometric stereo, but now we are recording with photogrammetry as well. So photogrammetry is likely to be familiar to most of you. So with photogrammetry, we can, of course, capture originals in their entirety. The system that we're using here at the Bodleian is called the Paleo Pi. It's a programmable turntable designed by Richard Allen, who sadly can't be with us today. But it's a great way of capturing originals, which are truly volumetric. It synchronizes rotation and capture. So we have a controller unit, and we can nominate a certain number of intervals per round and then record the original at several heights. And it's a highly efficient way of recording an original. So we take usually maybe 4 or 5 minutes to record an original, maybe 200 to 300 images maximum, and use software to create our 3D models. And it's a relatively inexpensive solution too. So it's been great for the Bodleian, and we've used that extensively over the year. But photometric stereo might be less well known. This was covered in last year's webinar. But it's a recording system, as I say, which is called the Selene, and the Bodleian were the first institution to use this technology. And the system works in an entirely different way, using a principle called photometric stereo. The 3D imaging, 3D data is acquired through the capture and processing of 2D images. And this 3D data is then stored within additional 2D files. So it's a very, very efficient way of storing 3D data. So just to cover roughly how it works for those who have not heard of photometric stereo, in our way of recording photometric stereo, we're just using 4 source images, 4 input images. So the original is lit from the top, right, bottom, and left. And then depending on where the shadows and highlights are, we can work out the surface of the original, the topography, and we can create some useful maps. So the first one is a normal map, and the normal map is storing a direction at each pixel. So instead of a color, as we're used to in a standard digital photograph, each pixel encodes a direction, a normal. And collectively, these angles or vectors map the surface of the original. So this is called the normal map. And the normal vectors can then be processed into another map. So if we look at a line of neighboring pixels, if we look at the top line there, we can see how the normal vectors can deform the shape or the topography of the surface along that line of pixels. So the arrows are pulling each pixel in a certain direction. And through doing that, we are creating a height map or a depth map. And these are incredibly effective and efficient because they are just 2-dimensional files, in this case, just a grayscale image, albeit a very high bit depth grayscale image. And with that height map or depth map, we can load that into GIS software, and we can decide where the light is coming from. We can move that not just to any one of those 4 source directions, top, right, bottom, and left, but we can move it to any altitude, any azimuth, to relight our render. And so it's a shame that Richard can't be here today, but this is one of the viewers that he's working on. To surface a 2.5D recording, we need a way of, first of all, layering our different derivatives. So we will have, for instance, a shaded render or several shaded renders. We might have a heat map. We have the albedo map, which encodes all of the color. So a layered view is essential. But then in order to give the user the ability to make changes to the render, and for them to relight as they choose, then we can also provide them with a viewer like this. So this is working on both the normal and on the albedo to give a sort of composite image which can be relit from any direction within the web browser. And this has kind of been a goal that we've been working towards over the last 2.5 years, in fact. And we're making a lot of progress with this. As the 4 source images are essentially just color images lit from different directions, we can also make an albedo map. So this is a big advantage over Factum's previous 3D recording solution, which is called the Lucida, because that just records height. With the Selene, we're recording both height and color, and they're in perfect registration, so that we can make composite images very, very quickly and easily. And this is a view that we'll all be familiar with, a wire mesh, which encodes 3D surface. But if we look at a depth map of the same original, we can see that this is a much, much more efficient way of encoding the 3D data. We think probably about 20 times as efficient at an equivalent resolution. So it's doing 2.5D recording in this way and storing the data in this way is far, far more efficient. And so let's look at some of the recordings that we've made over the last year. And as Thomas discussed in his presentation, they serve a few different purposes. Education, absolutely. Lots of time is spent sat next to students and curators, professors, trying to understand more about our collections through the recordings that we're making. And one of the key advantages about the Selene and the 2.5D imaging that we're doing here is it's incredibly quick to make the recordings. The 4 source images just take a couple of seconds to photograph, and then the processing of those 4 source images into derivatives, which we can then load into GIS software. We're only talking about a minute or so. So we can get results straight away. So for academics who don't have a great deal of time, or for curators that don't have much time, or can't leave originals with us for a large amount of time, we can get instant results, and that's a real game changer. Storytelling. as Thomas said, yeah. So we see lots of examples where we've learned something new about the history of an original or people's interaction with the original since it's made. We've got lots of examples of annotations being added at some point in an original's history, annotations which are almost impossible to see. And also Thomas mentioned creating a digital twin, and for conservation, for documenting the condition of an original. This is something that we're doing with our 3D recordings as well. So that's an important use case too. So 3D recordings allow us to see things which are impossible to see from a conventional photograph. So in this example, we see a heavily oxidized etched printing plate. Etched plates are incredibly, the details on them are incredibly shallow. They're not like engraved plates. And so if you've got any degree of corrosion, it's just really impossible to see the design. And I think it's really important to bring that information back, especially if there's no extant prints from them. So printing plates is something that I shared quite a lot in last year's session. We've done some more of that. This is a strangely shaped printing plate, we think, from the 18th century. And the 3D recording has allowed us to see this image here. So it's really astonishing how much detail you can actually bring out with a Celine recording, a photometric stereo recording. If we do a close up here, we can see this pastoral scene. There are 3 figures in the next to a stream, and a water wheel, grand house, a folly in the distance, all sorts of things that we just can't see from the original. So that's really exciting. So Dylan is responsible for making these amazing animations, which has been such a advantage having him on board for this year of Archeox. It's not something that I can do myself. So being able to present these really high resolution recordings in the way they deserve is quite a difficult thing to do, because just a single static image of a large original is going to look very homogeneous when viewed at a low magnification. And obviously with a higher magnification, we start to see the details, but we can't see the whole original in one go. So these animations play a really important part. But if we go back to this image, we can see it's a very strangely shaped printing plate. That's because this was used to make fans in the 18th century. This is sort of Rococo design, which would have been printed, folded up, and then made into fans. It would have been colored, so we have to guess what colors might have been used on the original fan. But this is kind of my work in progress, a facsimile sort of mock-up of how it might have appeared. Let's take a look at some other recordings. So obviously manuscripts are what I guess the Bodleian is most famous for, and they're not just European in origin. We've got a huge collection of Arabic manuscripts. This is from the Book of Curiosities. It's a copy of an Egyptian manuscript compiled almost exactly 1,000 years ago, and it consists of 23 maps and diagrams. What we're seeing here is the wak-wak tree, whose branches or fruits became the heads of men, women, or monstrous animals. So it's quite a sort of gory, strange scene. Perhaps someone's account of a journey that they made, and documenting what they might have seen when they came back in their manuscript. And it's an amazing recording. If we mix the color recording, the albedo, with the render of the surface, we end up with this sort of thing. So this is loading the height map or the depth map into GIS and the color, and looking at both together, and we can see the surface because we can, although it's captured directly from above, we can move around the maps obliquely as we are at the moment. An existing analysis has been carried out on the different pigments which are used for this manuscript. We can see them, how they've sort of behaved over time, the cracking and the crazing of all of these different pigments. We can also see an incision occasionally at the necks of each of these poor individuals on the manuscript. So whether it's been defaced or whether that was part of the original design, it's kind of difficult to know, but it's very interesting, and just to be able to see it in this way is great, because this is not something that you can certainly easily see from the original unless you had perhaps a microscope. This is another page from the same manuscript, and something that we see a great deal and have become very conscious of is that there's lots and lots of instances with our manuscript material of stylus being used as a preparatory stage before ink or pigment was applied to parchment or paper, whatever the manuscript might be. And we can see this throughout centuries and in different territories. So if we zoom into this part here, these mountains, we can see how the artists changed their design. We've got some preparatory blind stylus, which Dylan's marked up here. So this was the original design in stylus, and this is how the mountain is now. So the artist is sort of deviated from those original markings. And there's lots and lots of examples of stylus, which we'll be showing you. So this is a map which might be familiar to some of you. This is a 16th century edition of the Al-Idrisi world map. But what we didn't realize about this quite famous map really is that it's being copied in a way which is similar to the Goth map, which is another medieval map which I presented in last year's presentation. So we've here got pinholes, essentially very, very tiny pinholes, marking out the position of islands and coastline. And these were used to copy the map from one page to another to produce other versions of the map. So we've, in this case, marked up, or rather Dylan's marked up in orange markings that maybe there, maybe not. It's difficult to be absolutely sure. The blue ones we're far more confident about. So these annotations can't really be made automatically. We have to take a good look ourselves and work through it sort of objectively, as objectively as we can. From the same manuscript, we can see how stylus is being used in a different way. So we can see how the page has been divided up. So we've got all of these diagonal lines at the top here, which were made with a very sharp tool. And it really was a very sharp tool, and a very, very light touch as well. If you, I actually have bought a few styluses to try and get a sense for what it does to the surface and how much you can see on a modern paper. If you push with too much weight, you start to, sorry, let me just go back a sec. You start to bring parts of the paper up. So it's really important that you don't press too hard. So we can see stylus markings in a manuscript which was made by this man. So this is a portrait of the explorer and cartographer William Baffin. I've made lots of recordings recently of maps to prepare for a presentation about map making next month. So William Baffin was sort of famously known for his attempt to find a Northwest Passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. And Baffin became the first European to discover the bay, which now bears his name, which is situated between Canada and Greenland. His 2 voyages on the ship, which was called Discovery, proved unsuccessful in finding a path to the Orient. And so in 1617, Baffin instead joined the East India Company to chart the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. And Bodin is very lucky to have his atlas, which describes his voyage. He finished his atlas in 1619. It's got quite a long title, The Description of Such Lands, Roads and Harbours as Were Observed in the Royal Anne, Her First Voyage, with their several shows, appearing marks and depths, by William Baffin. So typically long title for a 16th century manuscript. And you can see that he took a really meticulous approach to presentation. So this frontispiece has been planned, and everything has been sort of planned out with stylus incisions. And we can see if we zoom in here in the render, Baffin's use of shorthand. So we've got the letter S indicating areas of the design which were to be shaded. If we look at the color, the albedo image, we can see those areas which were shaded. So this is the sort of preparatory work that we can uncover with the Selene, with photometric stereo. This is another of the folios here. So each folio charts the progress of Baffin's ship, which is called the Royal Anne, along the shores of Africa, India, Persia, and the Strait of Mecca. And we can see his use of shorthand again with vertical lines indicating trees and squares for buildings. And we can also see how some elements were not incised at all. So if you look at the ship here, it's a good example. There's absolutely no evidence of stylus incision there at all. And the atlas begins with the shores of the southern Africa. And he first sketched in elevation and then plotted in plan. So this is one of his maps in plan. Again, lots and lots of stylus incision. And here the stylus may have played a different part, perhaps transferring the position of geographical features from an earlier chart. So in exactly the same way as the Al-Idrisi map or the Goff map, we've got these pinholes for transfer. And we can also see how Baffin's final design differs from his preparatory work. So this is a really good example. If you look at the word north here, we can see how the position has been altered. This is his preparatory stylus work. So the word north is in a completely different position. And he seemed very interested in these cardinal points. So here we've got a fleur-de-lis marking on the north-south meridian. So if we look at the north line here, we can see a fleur-de-lis, which is a design that he didn't end up using in his final presentation. So we've recorded lots and lots of maps recently. This is a very beautiful one, which is collected by Francis Dowse, an atlas of the world. Lots of amazing maps from India and from Africa. Really beautiful. And each one shows a sort of different sort of point of interest, really. So this is on parchment, quite thick parchment. We can see some incisions here above the word India. We can see also how the gold leaf has been applied. You can see that as an addition on the surface there. And again, we can look at it in this sort of oblique presentation by loading it into GIS. We can get these recordings up in just a matter of a couple of minutes, which is really, really interesting and fun. And they sort of give us a new sense, a new way of looking at the images. This map was, as you can see, quite heavily cockled, quite wavy, so perhaps it got damp at some point. Parchment's very thick. Not the case here, where the paper in this case has been pasted to this heavy wooden board on this Portolan chart. This time we can see decoration as a sort of raised feature on top of the surface. And we can see the compass point. We can see all of these meridian lines here. Very beautiful things. And we can see a white pigment, perhaps a white lead, resting on top of the paper. And the same thing here. I'm not sure what the red pigment is, but it's really quite raised. And this is believed to be the oldest world map, or possibly the oldest map in the body, and this is over 1,000 years old. And it's simply text. So I think east is north at the moment. We've got Asia at the top. We've got Europe at the bottom left, and we've got Africa on the bottom right. I don't think much of Africa had been described at the point when it was made, because there are very few countries listed in Africa. We've got far more in Asia and Europe, some of which you will recognize, some not. Not too much in the way of preparatory markings here, other than the line guide, which was made using probably a more sort of rounded tool, less sharp. And you can see the waviness of the parchment if we make these composite images. Another diagram from the same manuscript here. We can see a repair on the right-hand side. We can see compass points, and we can see how actually the makers sort of aborted some of these original circles in favor of the 5 that you see in that image there. And we can see actually on another folio from the same manuscript, well, it's not really a repair. I think it's just an extension to the parchment. I guess parchment was very expensive and difficult to acquire. So we've got some amazing sort of 1,000-year-old needlework here, which attaches this other part of parchment onto the page. We can combine these recordings together. So it doesn't just have to be a photometric stereo recording or a albedo recording or any number of renders. We can also use other forms of recording and layer those in as well. Finding ways to present these sort of layers, these stacks of recordings, is something which we're desperately in need of. So it's really good that the IIIF are now accepting or starting to consider how we can use 2.5D recordings and put those into the browser-based solutions where we can surface these recordings. So this is a manuscript from 1226, made between 1226 and 1275. It's a moralized Bible. It's commissioned, I think, for Louis IX, and there are two sets of these amazing manuscripts. This is God holding a divider, creating heaven and earth, and we can see the same tool was used for the all of these tiny miniatures, 8 on each page. Throughout the manuscripts, they're all heavily illuminated and very, very beautiful. It must have been an absolutely enormous undertaking. Making these manuscripts must have costed an enormous amount of money. And it's been debated how 2 sets of these manuscripts could be made, which are pretty much identical. There's one in Toledo Cathedral, all 3 parts. Our part is one of 3. The other 2 are at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and the other one at the British Library. And they're very beautiful. So photometric stereo shows that it's probably part of the process was tracing the design. So we can see horizontals here of the crucifix. We've also done some transmitted light imaging, shining the light sheet from the verso to the recto. We've made albedo recordings of the blank verso and adjusted levels, and we've also used ultraviolet, infrared, and hyperspectral. So really, we've thrown all of the research imaging that we can at this one manuscript to see what happens when we layer up all of those different results. And that enables us to sort of go back to the point where the manuscript was being made to a blank sheet of parchment. Then we can put in the markings which are visible from the photometric stereo. So this is the tracing. Then we can see that an underdrawing would have been added in a carbon-based ink. I think the design would then have been improved. Then the gold leaf would have been applied, the burnished gold leaf, and then we can determine the order in which the pigments were applied to the parchment. So first a red lead, then we've got a dark azurite, it's almost grey. Then we've got a copper for the crucifix, it's beautiful green colour, and a lighter azurite, followed by an organic red. This was probably crushed up beetles, crushed up insects, and then a sort of brown ink for the details. So these are the stages which we can propose were involved in the production of this manuscript. And there probably would have been a whole team of different artisans working on this manuscript together. We can determine the order in which the pigments were applied with the very high resolution photometric stereo images. We can see in the albedo where pigments have sort of overlapped other pigments. As perfect as the artisans were, sometimes mistakes happened, and the pigments were sort of spread a little too far. But we can also use the Celine to make recordings of artworks, and the Bodleian has quite a large collection of portraits. This is a mysterious portrait which was painted in 1610, and I think I just about recorded this just in time for last year's presentation. But now we know a little bit more about it. We know that this was an underpainting, so it would have appeared quite different prior to 1838, when the overpainting, which is what we see now, would have been removed. In fact, it was copied twice before the overpainting was removed. That's one version, and that's the other version. So we're left with this portrait, which is an unknown woman. We know that it was probably painted in 1610. But the idea is, just as Thomas alluded to, with making a twin, a sort of digital surrogate, that it's really important to record at different stages in its conservation. So it was in a really bad state and needed to go away for conservation treatment. So it was decided that we should record it with the selene before, during, and after conservation. So this is kind of a before. And the next image is our after. So if we look at this recording, this is a during conservation picture. So the varnish has been removed in this case, and we've done a sort of deep zoom here. Dylan's done a great job of sort of zooming in to this recording, which is recorded at about 1,000 ppi, so 1 million pixels per square inch, incredibly high resolution. So that's a composite render, and we can see the same thing here as an oblique view, and we'll have a look at lots of different sort of presentations of the render. So this is albedo. We can take away the albedo, and that just leaves the shaded render. So we can look at the surface without the distraction of the tone and color, or we can put it into a heat map view like this, with warmer colors for higher areas, cooler colors for lower areas. So we can see it in lots of different ways. And these images, these recordings have been used by Harriet Standeven, who is bravely doing the restoration work on this Elizabethan portrait at the moment, because exactly how far to go with that restoration is difficult to assess, given the history of the painting, it being painted, overpainted, then the overpainting removed. It's got a long history. And we've got lots and lots of other portraits in our collection. Some are not very well known, and some are not actually out on display at all. Some are quite confusing. So we've got a portrait here. The reverse of the frame says Sir Thomas More, but it's a case of the back of the painting not matching the front. So we've got a wooden panel bearing the name Sir Thomas More, who was a 16th century statesman and martyr. And this is a portrait of one of our librarians, who was Noel Myers, who was the librarian from 1948 to 65. So Noel Myers' father was an archaeologist and historian, perhaps in the spirit of uncovering the past. He embraced X-ray and ordered the X-ray of lots of portraits in the collection, including this Sir Thomas More work. So in 1955, Myers wrote to a paintings conservator called Horace Buttery and informed him that an X-ray of the Thomas More portrait had revealed a perfectly preserved head of a lady. He goes on to write, Sir Thomas More, of course, is quite worthless, and I think we must have him off and cherche la femme, so to find a lady. So that's what he ordered, and thankfully, Buttery made this portrait, well, this recording of the painting as it was. So this is Thomas More before the overpainting was revealed, but it's pretty poor quality, and it reveals that the original appearance of the painting was a copy of Hans Holbein's portrait from 1527. And so what was revealed after they removed the overpainting of Sir Thomas More was this. This is the lady that they revealed. It's interesting to know quite what they thought of this and whether they felt a bit shortchanged, because the portrait itself, as you can see, is not of amazing quality. So yeah, very interesting decision. But we were wondering whether there was any evidence of the Sir Thomas More painting under the surface. Dylan, do you want to talk about what you did with this recording as we sort of play the video?
Yeah, I'll try and remember it as we go. But basically, I overlaid the shaded kind of the gradient depth map, and I noticed there was this kind of S pattern just in her hairline, and so I overlaid a Thomas More portrait and lined up that S, and found that the his chain kind of necklace thing was lined up exactly with her hairline. I can't remember exactly the steps that we took, or exactly what we kind of gleaned from that. Was it that
I don't think we were expecting to see anything in particular. I think
Yeah.
it was quite amazing that we managed to reveal anything at all. What was surprising is I think that the overpainting was at 180 degrees from the original.
Yeah, that was weird. That was unexpected. They didn't have any record of that, did they? Was that said anywhere?
Definitely not. I mean, I wasn't expecting to see anything at all. But it just shows actually you can see an awful lot more in the render than even on the original. Okay. So perhaps Myers was delighted and perhaps he felt shortchanged. We don't really know, but this is what he ended up with. It's a shame that the Thomas More portrait wasn't photographed in color before it was removed. It absolutely could have been, because Kodachrome was introduced 20 years earlier in 1935. So this is all that remains of the overpainting, sadly. We can kind of recreate how it might have looked by putting it in the frame that now houses the portrait of the unknown lady, and by using some of the color from the Hans Holbein image. So this is our best guess of how it must have looked prior to 1955. So we've also got other kinds of portraits in our collection. So it looks like a pencil sketch, but in fact it's not. This is a calotype, and I think the original is in the Ashmoleans collection. And we can see in the render here, there's no markings of any sort of pencil or anything like that, which is fairly obvious. You can actually see where the paper was coated, probably with silver nitrate, to produce the calotype that we see. A really pretty portrait. We can see when loaded into GIS, we can have a look at the surface in this way. And it's a small portrait. This would have taken just a couple of seconds to record. And one of the other neat things that you can do with photometric stereo imaging is that you can, unlike a laser-based system, you can record through glass. So we've got a portrait here, very small portrait, which has got this sort of domed glass, which would be a complete nightmare to photograph even conventionally, and impossible with a laser system. But by using a 100mm lens, we've managed to record this at 4 million pixels per square inch. So this is the render that we see here. We can see the layers of paint on the surface through the glass. This is the composite image. Very pretty portrait. But as I said at the beginning, it's not just body material that we've been recording. So we've taken the Celine recording system to the Ashmolean to make recordings there as well. So we can see lots and lots of preparatory blind stylus on this work, which is by Giulio Romano. And if we isolate these markings, we can do something similar to what we did with the French manuscript. We can sort of trace the stages of the process of making this drawing. So we can see the vanishing point here. We can see lots of lines for gridding and for perspective. Then we can see how Giulio Romano used a sort of broad outline, probably to trace the image to a different page. So again, stylus being used to transfer to a different copy. But his master was Raphael, and we can see a Raphael recording here. And this is a really, really nice example of how preparatory blind stylus works with high Renaissance drawings. So we can see fairly deep incisions at the wrists, with the elbows, the navel, foreheads, all sorts of parts of anatomy within the figures in this drawing. We've also got some very light markings as just sort of sketching the rough outlines, just kind of loosening up the wrist in a way to make the drawing. It's hard to imagine how these really faint markings actually guided the artist, because they're really practically invisible. So to be able to bring these back to see them clearly is quite amazing and very, very useful to art historians. We can see the whole work here, and we can see the set through from the other side. So we've got a figure who is seemingly upside down coming through from the reverse. Clearly, Raphael didn't have a large stock of paper to work from. And again, Dylan's done a great job here marking up all of these incisions. Dylan, do you want to take us through this one?
Yeah, sure. So these are kind of the initial markings. These are very straight parallel lines that would have been kind of the geometric lines where body forms would have been initially planned out, which were then followed by, I mean, it's already gone past now, but there were the rough sketch lines, which are even hard to see in the composite, which are then traced over, which then he would have done his final drawing over. Am I audible? Yes, okay. Just double checking. And then there were the pinpricks there as well, which he would have used to copy them over, I assume just to make a probably more final or better version. But we had to ask some, who did we ask to actually figure out the steps? Because when I was tracing over it, I had to go through, it's when looking at the grayscale image, it's just, you lose all of the ink and it's just a series of lines and dots, and it's very hard to tell what's the actual texture, like grain of the paper, what's a deliberate sketch line. The geometric lines are very easy to see in comparison because they're always much sharper, much deeper gouges in very straight lines. But then actually going through and determining what was a sketch. I think if you scrub back a bit when the sketch lines start coming in, if you look at the right hand of the leftmost figure, you can see his hand sort of is in two different places at once because he's figuring out where exactly to put it. So while tracing all of this, it's very difficult to tell while actually doing it what's a deliberate marking, what might just be the grain of the paper, until you zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture and compare it with the actual final ink, and you can see this shifting position of the hand where he's changing his mind as he goes. And at the bottom right of the image, it's very, very vague what's going on there. That was all very difficult to tell.
That's right, and I think these annotations need to be made in the benefit of context. So we've been working with an art historian who is working at the Ashmolean, working on the catalogue raisonné for Raphael's artworks. But yeah, these changes in the preparatory work, between the preparatory work and the final design, are really, really intriguing to art historians. So this is a good discovery. We can see the drawing with the set through there. So the reverse is this image. And these were not just sort of sketches for the sake of sketches. These were made up into frescoes. So this is kind of exciting because these stylus markings are really the first transition between the artist's imagination onto paper. The paper would have been then copied to a sort of secondary design, perhaps, and then worked up into finally these amazing frescoes. So it's really, really fascinating to see the thought process of Raphael in this case. We've got another High Renaissance example here. This is a late Michelangelo crucifixion, but we can see a different feature of interest here, which is also incredibly interesting to art historians. This is a watermark that we see in the top right here. We can also see the chain lines and laid lines in the paper, and this gives us an idea of when the drawing was made. So incredibly important. We get a similar thing with parchment. So what we see here obviously is paper, and we can see that the markings are on the mold side of the paper, so we can see that very clearly in impressions which the paper mold is making, the chain lines and the laid lines. We have a similar sort of thing with parchment, where you have the hair side and you have the flesh side of the parchment. The hair side has got more natural texture in the substrate, and that makes any deliberate markings very difficult to discern. We've got the same thing with the mold side of the paper here. So far easier to annotate deliberate markings on the felt side of the paper or on the flesh side of the parchment. And other examples too. So we're back to Raphael here with very liberal blind stylus, which we can see going into the application of ground on the surface. You can even see the brush strokes where the ground was applied on the paper here. And another example, so switching between the albedo and the composite image, we can see compass marks, we can see compass ticks at the bottom here. So this was a means of dividing the page. I'm not exactly sure why, whether it was just to get proportions correct, or whether it was to do with transferring the design onto perhaps a fresco or onto a secondary piece of paper. And this is a really, really pretty example. This was a sort of preparatory drawing which was made. Let's see if it will play, hopefully. Perhaps not. Sadly, never mind. Another time. Anyway, so I've shown lots of these. Is your microphone on mute? Sorry about that. So I've shown lots of map examples that I've recorded recently, but of course it's not just the Earth that we've mapped, also the stars as well. So this is a manuscript which belongs to the Museum of the History of Science, which is opposite to us across the road on Broad Street. And it's a paper astrolabe. This probably had a home in the Radcliffe Observatory several centuries ago, and it would have been used by John Radcliffe himself. And we can see exactly the same sort of thing here in the renders. So if we take a close-up view here, we can see all of this preparatory blind stylus, far more geometric, far more mathematical here. And this is probably the best example of preparatory blind stylus that I've seen. Absolutely everything has been marked up. It may have even sort of been used as channels, which the pen would then have sort of run along. So that might have been its use. But they are incredibly shallow and really beautifully formed. And then we thought, well, let's record the rete, this revolving piece, separately. And so we've got the albedo and we've got the shaded render here. And then we thought, well, if we make these black parts transparent, then we can maybe make a video of an animation of the astrolabe.
Okay,
Yeah.
There we go. I'm speaking. Yes. Yeah, this was just a kind of simple proof of concept. I mean, to actually make this animation was very easy. It's just overlaying the composite and the not the composite, the albedo and the shaded grayscale render to get an idea of how it would have looked actually in motion, or not in motion, in use. It's not completely perfect because we have to I mean, how big actually was this astrolabe? Because I didn't get to see it. It was quite.
It was probably about A4 size square.
Right. So there was some stitching that had to be done through like panorama software to actually get it to because it had to be shot in tiles. So it's not exactly completely circular, I don't think. So it kind of runs along the edge a bit closer. I'm going to point at my screen as if that's any help. But yeah, no, that's just actually an incredibly simple thing to do is just find the center point and just send it to rotate and crossfade through the shaded and the albedo.
But it would be absolutely amazing if we could find a way of allowing that sort of functionality in a web browser, for instance. I think that would be a fantastic thing to do. So if anyone's got any ideas about how to make that happen, Thomas, maybe you do, that would be great to know. We've got other examples from different pages here. So I think there was probably 8 or 9 different astrolabes or devices in this pasteboard manuscript. We can see loads and loads of preparatory work here. And this is the final, the albedo. Lots and lots of markings. And you could just imagine that if he made a mistake at any point during this design, it would have been a catastrophe. So yeah, it's really quite amazing. It's very skillful work. Dylan's done a really nice job of this particular folio with another fantastic animation. So starting to use Premiere for surfacing some of these recordings, which is really been really helpful.
Yeah, so for the animation, well, I say animations for the kind of crossfades that we did with the Raphael drawings, that's just done in Photoshop with their timeline feature, which is incredibly limited when it comes to actually making anything more than just crossfades or zooms. And so making this in Premiere is leagues easier, although it does eventually come to the you see right there, I had zoom ins to specific areas of the frame. That gets quite difficult when you're dealing with images that are of this size, that are absolutely, you know, however many pixels across to store all of that information. So there's a lot of kind of workarounds that I have to do every now and then, that or just kind of rely on the computer to process it if I just give it a couple hours.
That's great. So let's talk about some of the photogrammetry work that we've done as well. So as I said before, we're using a system called the Paleo Pi, which is designed by Richard Allen, my colleague at Bodleian Digital Library Systems and Services. And yeah, we're recording. We've been recording lots and lots of our designer bindings, our beautiful bindings from the Bodleian using photogrammetry. And we've developed a fairly robust sort of workflow for making these photogrammetric recordings. We've got a slightly, maybe not unique problem, but a persistent problem anyway, that books and manuscripts, once they're turned from their sort of head end to their tail end, as it were, to record the bottom of the book or the manuscript, often they can change in shape and volume. So they might sort of expand slightly or maybe contract slightly. And so the recordings don't really work very well. But we've developed a fairly good workflow. If we look at the peacock at the top of this recording here, it's really tiny. It's about the same size as my thumbnail, just a few millimeters. So as well as recording it in with photogrammetry, I've also recorded it with the Selene with photometric stereo as well. So this is a 4 million pixel per square inch recording of the peacock, and we can see the amazing detail in this embroidered binding. And we've recorded probably about 70 different bindings now. These are all on our Sketchfab account, and they're very beautiful. Lots of them come from the Broxbourne collection, which were collected by Albert Ehrman. And I don't think this is actually an example of one from his collection, but it's a very pretty textile binding. This is one from Ehrman's collection. And Ehrman had a particular interest in book binding. He named his collection after his hometown in Hertfordshire, which is called Broxbourne. This is a very strange book. The accompanying note with this volume states that it was sold by E.P. Goldschmidt, and it's a rare example of a book which is printed in a small town in Normandy, preserved in its original binding, which in fact comprises astronomical instruments, without which no copy can be said to be complete. So exactly how these instruments work, I'm not really sure, but it's very interesting. And then, although mostly we've recorded bindings just on aesthetic rationale, really. I mean, we do have some examples of recordings made not on aesthetics, but on sort of provenance. So this is an incredible small printed volume, which has an intriguing story surrounding its provenance. So it's presented to the library in 1893 and catalogued by the librarian E.W.B. Nicholson as being found in Percy Shelley's Dead Hand. So we can see it's a very small water-damaged volume. And it's in fact a copy of Sophocles, which may have been in Percy Shelley's hand when he drowned. We can see a thumbprint in the top edge here. And there's lots of evidence to support that Percy Shelley did actually own this volume. So we've made lots and lots of photogrammetric recordings, also of things in our collections like globes. So this is a Braille globe, for instance. And we have a workflow whereby we capture probably around 24 to 30 images per round, maybe at about 4 or 5 different heights. And typically we turn the original over and record another 2 rounds, something like that. And our sort of house style is to create final models, which are about 500,000 polygons. We figured that is probably a good resolution to surface on Sketchfab because they can be loaded fairly easily with a smartphone, which is a good sort of acid test of the resolution that we are aiming for. So we can see a relief globe here. And we're starting to use PBR shaders to mimic the surface of originals. Got lots and lots of examples of that. Here we've got a relief map of Mont Blanc. And it's interesting when you look at this photogrammetric recording because it actually looks like a sort of computer generated relief map. But in fact, what we're doing here is we're actually mapping, 3D mapping the 3D map, which is kind of a really interesting thing to do. So we'll see in a second that actually this is a real map made up of polygons, and we can see here because my hand's in the shot. But as well as recording at the Ashmolean and at the History of Science, we've also made recordings at the University Museum of Natural History. So what appears here as a landscape is in fact a really tiny fossil, and actually we haven't really made many recordings of natural originals prior to a couple of months ago. When I went over to the Natural History Museum for a week. So this is the same fossil held in my hand. So you get it's difficult. You can lose sense of scale when you're looking at these very high resolution recordings. They kind of look like landscapes, but actually it's a really tiny original. We can see that we can use our photometric stereo recordings in different ways to make different renders. So this works really nicely as a heat map render. We've got a very sort of kind of what appears to be a smooth sort of uniform surface with this these fossilized leaves, but if you look at the render you can see actually it's a very interesting surface. You just can't see it from a conventional image. So by combining the two you can make a really interesting composite, and you can see the veins on all of these leaves as well. And where we've got really tiny originals, these tiny fossils, researchers have been using RTI imaging to get a better glimpse of the fossil insects. So this is actually a fossil wasp, but to be able to do it in the really efficient, incredibly quick way that we're doing it with Archeox has been great, because you can sit next to the researcher, you get a result straight away. So that's been sort of transformative, really. We can see the wasp's abdomen here, you can see all the different sections, you can see the antenna, you can see their legs. It's really great. We've used photometric stereo on feathers and wings. They're really beautiful, these recordings. They're kind of artworks in themselves. I can't take too much credit. They just come out that way. It's really amazing. And we can even see with a very high res recording here of a butterfly's wing, you can start to see the individual scales and the way that they reflect light. So again, really fantastic recording. And I should say, to be fair, that the photometric stereo recordings are really good at what we call high frequency variation, less good at low frequency variation. So the general form, the general shape is not perfectly recorded, but these individual details are very, very accurate indeed. You can see a really nice example of a fossil here. The render looks really beautiful. And this is the combination of the albedo and the render, a close up. So it was nice working with the students at the Natural History Museum, and they were selecting lots of originals. Once they understood what it was that I was imaging, they made a really amazing selection of different fossils. Here we've got some ammonites. And this is a feather, a macaw's feather, parrot feather. So this is a composite recording. And the animation's, I think, really exciting. Looks very otherworldly. And just a few more recordings. So this is something which is back in the Bodleian collections. This is a 2nd century wax tablet. We didn't really know too much about this because, I mean, it had never been photographed in any way because it's just so dark. The black wax is kind of really impossible to read. I've heard that some institutions would blow chalk dust onto the surface of these black wax tablets, and then it would appear a bit like a blackboard. So the chalk dust would gather in the incisions and you would be able to read the text more clearly. Obviously, we do not want to do that in today. So best thing we can do is to record it with the Selene, and we can see these incisions really, really easily. So we've got Roman cursive on one side, and I think Greek on the other side of this tablet. So that's kind of the last recording that I'd like to show, but it kind of demonstrates the importance of recording using 3D. And we are going to continue with our sort of mission to record across Oxford University's institutions, and to find ways of presenting them, which is, I guess, the theme of today's discussion. And I'm very keen on finding out ways of making these recordings public, because it's all very well for me to make them, but obviously we need to share them, and so that's the challenge. Costanza.
Exactly, and that's why we're here also, maybe to promote a discussion about it and can bring to further results. Too bad that Richard is not here today, but because exactly he would have spoke about his work for making this material accessible. But again, as said, he will make accessible the slides, so we will share the slides at least, or maybe we will find another way to well, convey the results. I think there will be other occasions, and well, and also talking about one of the latest in the Astrolabs animation is one of the things, the things that would be amazing to have shared on a viewer that is at the moment not really possible, and of course many things also on 2.5D surfaces too that would be great to see and annotate, for example, the watermarks, as we said, the pinholes, the damages. And well, I saw that there are a couple of questions, so I think I will revert to are both for John for now, but I invite all people to ask questions in the chat or raising your hand for all speakers. So Gabriela is asking about the 3D model of the small portrait under the glass. How you managed to capture the incredible detail?
Photometric stereo is great because it does work through glass. it means that we can image things like papyrus, which is usually sort of sandwiched between two sheets of glass, because otherwise it would just fall apart. It works because the light is just traveling through from 4 different directions. So long as the edge of the frame is not too close to the detail which you want to capture and doesn't cast a shadow, then it works perfectly, because all it's doing is it's introducing those shadows and highlights, and where those shadows and highlights fall, that's what the software can assess, and you can make a height map from the normal map. But where it doesn't work so well is if the surface of the glass is dirty or scratched, then you end up catching those details in your render too, which is obviously not what we want. There's nothing that can be done about that. But yeah, it works incredibly well through glass.
And the other, thank you. And the other question was how you managed to preserve the shape of the object during the process. And she was referring especially about the books that you showed on Sketchfab. If it's more the capturing technique itself, so photogrammetry in that case, or the post-processing.
Dylan, do you want to say that?
Yeah, sure. So there's a number of different techniques we use depending on the volume. For the most part, what I found is the best way to do it is I need a prop. Let's use this. If you have a book this way up, and you place it on our turntable, as the turntable turns, I find that the book slowly opens as it shakes with the frequency of the turntable turning. It will slowly open up over time. So what I prefer to do is to place a block and put the book on top, because then it's relying on the weight of the book itself to keep itself shut. And then as that turns, shoot a round of it turning, just raise the camera, do that again and again and again. And then once you've shot all the rounds of that, you turn it upside down and get it that way. And that leaves a consistent width of the book. And then once the 3D model is generated, you just prop it upright again. But obviously that doesn't work for every book, because some books might be very shallow or have very thin and papery front covers. So there are methods where place it upright and I'll get 2 blocks to kind of clamp it at the bottom, not clamp it, but place the volume between these 2 blocks to keep it shut. And then just once I've done that, flip it upside down, place it between the 2 blocks again, and that will keep it, it'll change size a little bit, likely, mostly in the middle. But to get the blocks out, you just mask them out, and the software should hopefully recognize that you've shot half of a book and then the other half of a book, and then just simply merge them together. With that open book that we did, where the page was at the 2 front covers, or the front and back cover were open. I think John's finding it now. Ooh, I think it was just to the, yeah, there you go. Yeah. I say we, this was John. I would not trust myself to do this. Just got some clear plastic and kind of made I don't know, how would you describe it? Just
this is a mylar sheet, which you can cut up to make strips, and that holds the text blocks together. It's a conservation approved method, and it's used for exhibitions.
And it's by doing that, we will have to only shoot the book at one orientation. So there's no way to look underneath at the bottom of that book, because if we were to move it and flip it upside down after that, it's almost certainly guaranteed to have changed shape in some way, which the software just won't recognize when compiling and aligning all the images. This is another one we did. There's another mylar strip just going down there, and a block of foam keeping that kind of covering flap open. And again, you'll see that there's actually no way to look under this model. And if if the horizontal book method doesn't work, if the clamps at the bottom don't work, then it's just going to have to be a single-sided model, no way to look underneath it. But it's better to have, a single-sided model and to not have a model at all, because the detail that you get to look at and the material properties that we put onto these models as well, really, like, they come together in such a beautiful way.
Thank you. And then there is another question, maybe more for Thomas, about what are the minimum requirements to be able to use a IIIF compliant viewer showing 3D data. And yeah, I hope I understood the question correctly. To use as a user, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I mean, currently there is no spec for 3D and IIIF. It's in development, so it's not something people can necessarily try. There are the code experiments that I had some screenshots of, and they're available on GitHub, and they can be cloned and copied and forked, and then essentially you could replace the 3D file path and point to your own 3D file. Currently, I believe the most common 3D file that these demos are being made with are .glb files. So that would be probably one thing to look into. But as it's not a finalized in any way specification, there's nothing really I can say is like, this is what you need, or this is what you have to do. It would be worth familiarizing oneself with the way that 2D data is hosted on IIIF servers, because I would assume that down the line there will be a similar sort of setup for how you would set up a IIIF compliant server for 3D as well. And all these links are in the presentation.
Thank you. I see other messages. No more appreciation messages. Thank you. Great job. Also with the animation, very didactic. They are. In the meantime, we wait maybe for the last question, because it's already 5 o'clock. I wanted to ask Tom about the interoperability between IIIF and OpenUSD, since one is more commercial.
Sure. So the kind of interaction between the two groups is in the very early stages. So currently, I have presented IIIF to the OpenUSD working group. At one time, we're kind of in the process of organizing a reciprocal presentation about OpenUSD to the IIIF group. I imagine that it will be sort of a very slow process to kind of align anything technically, but I think there's a value in having within the OpenUSD, you saw that consortium of commercial companies and who's kind of behind that spec, and having a heritage voice within there to simply flag up, well, these are some of the requirements that would be very useful for the heritage context, to have them in the minds of the people developing there, and similarly to have some insights from what the work that they're doing on very specific sets of data to help inform the work that the IIIF 3D group is doing as well. So it remains to be seen exactly how it works, but the USD file itself, as the name suggests, it's designed to accommodate a scene of data. So that could be audio, animation, multiple 3D files that can then be sent as a single file package between softwares. So if you imagine that a 3D manifest or a manifest, IIIF manifest for a 3D scene is simply a list of all the elements within that scene. And for USD, it's similar. It's a kind of a reference to all the assets within that scene. So they're just very similar. And rather than letting these two different things kind of roll on independently, I think we're trying to at least kind of have some parallel thinking as we go.
Which would be great. Yeah, thank you. Well, thumbs up. My consideration could be endless. I don't know if you guys want to add something in conclusion. Otherwise, maybe another message. I was about to say, otherwise we can wrap it up. Well, I don't know if you were reading, but another message of appreciation about the thank you for the incredible class. And so I think I will thank again you all for participating, speakers and people attending. It has been very interesting. Let's keep in touch. And yes, there will be a recording. I'm reading the last question. There will be the recordings of the classes, also of the previous one, will be published on the website, archivevenice.com. Well, the website of archive. I can paste it 1 second. Or probably you know it already. If you are following, if you are here today, probably you know already the website. Pasting it now. So this is the website. And as said, let's keep in touch. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thanks, Costanza.
Cheers.
Bye.